The plain around Ibelin lay low and wide beneath a pale coastal sky. In early spring the grasses were thin and green, broken by stones half buried by older seasons. Wind moved steadily from the sea, carrying salt and the distant cry of birds, brushing the walls of the small lordship without urgency. Roads crossed the land without ceremony, their paths pressed into the earth by carts, animals and feet that had learned the routes through repetition rather than design. Nothing here announced itself as history. It was ground that accepted passage and endured it. Morning came quietly. The light did not rush. It spread across fields, touched olive trees and low vineyards, and settled on the square stone tower that marked Ibelin's center. The tower did not dominate the land so much as punctuate it. Around it lay workshops, storehouses, a chapel, and the clustered dwellings of laborers and retainers. Smoke rose thinly from hearths. The rhythm of the place was practical. Work preceded ceremony. Balian of Ibelin moved through this landscape as part of it. He rode early, before the sun reached its height, along the road that traced the edge of the fields. His horse knew the path and required little guidance. Balian's attention stayed on the ground ahead, on the condition of fences, on the men already at work among the vines. He was not yet burdened by reputation. In these hours he was simply the lord present among his lands, measuring what had endured the winter and what had not. He had not inherited Ibelin in triumph. The lordship had come to him, through the slow and unremarkable processes of family and obligation. His elder brother's death had left the responsibility open, and the expectation had settled upon him without celebration. There was no moment of elevation that could be pointed to later. There had been a day when the keys were placed in his hand, a ledger passed across a table, and a short exchange of nods that marked the transfer as complete. From that point onward, the place required him. Balian learned the weight of that requirement not in councils or ceremonies, but in mornings like this. A broken irrigation channel demanded labor and stone. A tenant's complaint over boundaries needed listening and judgment. Grain stores had to be measured against mouths, and promises made the previous year had to be honored or renegotiated. Each decision carried forward into the next season. None of them felt dramatic, but together they formed the texture of rule. The land itself imposed restraint. Rain was uncertain. Heat could arrive early and linger. The soil gave enough when treated carefully, and little when pressed. Balian came to understand that his authority was less about command than about alignment. To force the land was to waste it. To force the people was to invite quiet resistance or flight. Stability depended on recognizing limits before they were tested. The lordship sat within a web of routes connecting the coast to the interior. Merchants passed through with salt, cloth, and metal goods. Pilgrims traveled toward Jerusalem, their pace uneven, their provisions uncertain. Soldiers moved in small groups, never far from the awareness that the roads could turn hostile beyond the next rise. Ibelin's position made it a place of passage rather than destination. That fact shaped its needs. Markets had to function without excess. Guards had to be alert without provoking fear. Justice had to be visible but predictable. Balian's days filled with observation. He listened more than he spoke, not from caution alone but from necessity. The lordship had its own memory, held by stewards, elders, and craftsmen, whose families had worked the land before his name carried weight there. They knew where water failed in dry years, which walls had been hastily built, which agreements had held only because no one had yet tested them. Their knowledge was not written. It was embedded in habit. Responsibility emerged before ambition. Balian did not arrive with plans to reshape Ibelin. The place asked first to be maintained. He learned to think in cycles rather than moments. A decision made in the market echoed in the fields. A judgment delivered in the hall affected the willingness of men to answer a call months later. Authority revealed itself as cumulative. Beyond the fields, the wider world pressed in quietly. The kingdom of Jerusalem existed through layers of obligation and tension that were never entirely at rest. Lords balanced loyalty to the crown with the realities of their own territories. Alliances shifted through marriage, debt, and inheritance more often than through open conflict. News arrived slowly, carried by riders and merchants, altered by distance and retelling. Balian received it without urgency, weighing how much of it mattered to Ibelin's immediate needs. Yet disorder was never absent. It lingered at the edges, in the form of banditry along lesser roads, in disputes between neighboring lords over grazing rights, in the unspoken awareness that the balance of power in the region was not fixed. Balian encountered it not as a singular threat, but as a constant pressure requiring management. One afternoon, as summer approached, a group of merchants arrived late, their carts damaged, their faces drawn. They had been harassed along the road, not attacked outright but slowed and threatened enough to lose time and goods. The men spoke cautiously, aware that complaints carried consequences. Balian listened, noting the pattern rather than the incident. The road in question had long been vulnerable, its maintenance neglected, its patrols irregular. He did not respond with force. There was no call to arms, no swift punitive expedition. Instead, he ordered the road repaired and the watch adjusted. Laborers were assigned to clear the brush that narrowed sightlines. Guards were instructed to vary their routes rather than follow predictable schedules. The response was methodical, almost dull. It took weeks. The merchants returned later and found the passage easier. Word spread quietly. Restraint became habit. When disputes arose between tenants, Balian resisted the temptation to assert authority through spectacle. He held hearings in the open, allowed grievances to be aired, and delivered judgments grounded in precedent where possible. When precedent failed, he chose outcomes that preserved relationships rather than asserting dominance. Some decisions displeased both parties equally, which he learned to accept as a sign of balance rather than failure. Through these processes, systems became visible to him. Justice was not an abstract ideal, but a sequence of actions repeated until trusted. Markets depended on weights and measures being consistent, not on profit alone. Survival rested on cooperation across lines of language and faith that official decrees rarely acknowledged. The lordship functioned because people believed it would continue to function. Time passed through seasons. Summer brought heat and labor, harvests that tested storage and distribution. Autumn demanded accounting, the settling of obligations before winter. Each cycle reinforced the previous one. Balian aged into the role without noticing the change until others treated his presence as expected rather than provisional. With familiarity came cost. The constancy required of him narrowed his world. Decisions followed him into sleep. Fatigue settled not as exhaustion but as accumulation. Losses occurred quietly. A trusted steward died of illness, a harvest fell short, a judgment alienated a family whose cooperation had once been reliable. None of these events were singularly defining, but together they weighed upon him. Still, continuity mattered more than the individual moments. Balian began to think beyond his own tenure, though not yet in terms of succession. He considered how records were kept, how knowledge was passed, how authority could be exercised without his direct presence. He delegated carefully, not to relieve himself but to ensure that the structures he relied upon did not depend solely on him. In these early years, his name remained local. He was known along the roads he maintained and within the markets he regulated. That was enough. The wider currents of the kingdom moved beyond his immediate concern, though they brushed against Ibelin more often as time passed. Responsibility had expanded, but ambition had not yet followed it. As the year turned again and the wind returned from the sea with its familiar insistence, the Tower of Ibelin stood unchanged. Stone endured where intentions shifted. Balian rode the same paths, inspected the same walls, listened to the same voices, though some had aged and others had been replaced. The land accepted this continuity without comment. In the quiet persistence of these routines, a pattern took shape. Authority was not declared, it was practiced. Order was not imposed, it was maintained. The lordship did not announce its future, but it carried it forward in small, deliberate acts. What endured was not the man alone, but the work repeated until it became structure. Autumn settled over Ibelin with a thinning of light. The heat receded without ceremony, leaving behind cooler mornings and longer shadows along the walls. Dust lingered on the roads where carts had passed through the summer, pressed into the earth by repeated wheels. The fields showed the marks of use rather than abundance. What had grown was gathered. What remained waited. Balian moved through the season with measured pace. Harvest demanded presence more than command. He stood at the edges of fields, watched the counting of sheaves, listened as stewards recorded figures that would determine the winter. Grain was apportioned carefully, neither hoarded nor freely given. Storage was an act of trust. What was sealed now would be opened later under scrutiny. The market adjusted with the season. Traders arrived less frequently, their goods more varied, their needs more specific. Salt and dried fish came inland from the coast. Wool and oil moved outward. Prices shifted not by decree, but by availability. Balian observed these changes from the margins, intervening only when weights were questioned or disputes threatened to linger. His authority remained visible through consistency rather than presence. Responsibility expanded quietly. A neighboring estate struggled after a failed yield, its lord absent for reasons that were not discussed openly. Requests arrived indirectly, framed as inquiries rather than pleas. Balian weighed them against his own stores and obligations. Aid given too freely could weaken Ibelin. Aid withheld entirely could invite resentment or instability. He chose a measured response, releasing grain with terms attached, repayment deferred rather than forgiven. The agreement was recorded, witnessed, and left to stand on its own. Through such exchanges, relationships formed that were neither alliances nor rivalries. They were practical bonds shaped by necessity. Balian learned the value of being predictable. In a landscape where rumor traveled faster than fact, reliability carried weight. Winter brought rain in uneven intervals. Paths softened, then hardened again. Travel slowed. The lordship turned inward. Repairs took precedence over expansion. Walls were inspected, roofs patched, tools mended. Balian spent longer hours indoors, reviewing accounts, listening to reports, hearing petitions that had been delayed by distance or weather. The hall filled with the low murmur of obligation rather than ceremony. It was during these months that awareness of the wider order pressed more firmly upon him. Messages from Jerusalem arrived with greater frequency, carried by men whose expressions revealed as much as their words. The crown required acknowledgement, levies adjusted, obligations clarified. These demands were not sudden, but they accumulated. Balian responded carefully, affirming loyalty without overextension. His duty to the realm did not erase his duty to his land. Disorder appeared again, not as violence but as uncertainty. Conflicting claims emerged over rights long assumed rather than proven. A road maintenance agreement was challenged, a toll questioned. These disputes carried the risk of escalation if left unresolved. Balian convened those involved, not in isolation, but in proximity to the places in question. He believed that land clarified argument better than words. Judgment required restraint. To favor one claim too strongly would set precedent beyond the immediate case. To avoid decision altogether would invite repetition. He chose outcomes that limited future dispute, even when they curtailed his own authority. The lordship functioned better when boundaries were clear, even if they were narrower. Spring returned with cautious warmth. Growth resumed where it had been planned for, less so where neglect had crept in. Balian noticed the difference. Fields reflected decisions made months earlier. Systems revealed their consequences slowly. This understanding shaped his approach to new responsibilities that emerged with the season. A request came from Jerusalem for increased support along a route that connected Ibelin more directly to the city. The road carried pilgrims and supplies, but it also carried risk. Increased traffic brought opportunity and threat in equal measure. Balian considered the cost. More guards meant more mouths to feed, more authority exercised beyond familiar bounds. Refusal was possible, but it would mark Ibelin as unreliable. He accepted, conditionally. The route would be supported, but under terms that preserved local control. Patrols were coordinated with existing structures rather than imposed from outside. Responsibility expanded, but it did so along lines already in place. Stability remained the measure. The burden of leadership deepened with these choices. Time once spent among the fields shifted toward coordination and oversight. Balian felt the narrowing of his days. Fatigue followed him more closely. He recognized it not as weakness but as cost. Authority demanded attention even when the body resisted. Loss accompanied this phase. A trusted guard was killed along the road during an encounter that resolved without further incident. The death was noted, compensated, and absorbed into routine. There was no spectacle. The absence lingered longer than the event. Balian marked it privately, aware that such losses accumulated beyond accounting, yet continuity persisted. The systems he relied upon adjusted rather than fractured. New stewards learned from older ones. Records grew thicker, habits solidified. The lordship extended its reach without altering its character. As the year closed again, the wind returned with familiar insistence, moving across the plain and against the stone of the tower. Balian stood where he had stood before, observing land that bore the marks of use and care. He understood now that expansion did not announce itself. It arrived through repetition, through agreements honored, through restraint practiced until it shaped expectation. What endured was not ambition fulfilled, but responsibility carried forward. The road remained passable. The market functioned. Justice held. The lordship continued, shaped less by moments of decision than by the quiet discipline of maintaining what already existed. Summer arrived without transition. Heat settled early in the day and lingered into evening, pressing against stone and skin alike. The wind that had once cooled the fields now carried dust, lifting it from the roads and laying it against walls and doorways. Movement slowed not by decree, but by necessity. Work shifted to mornings and late afternoons. Midday became a pause rather than a space for decision. Balian adapted his routine to the season. He rode before sunrise, when the air still held the night's restraint, and returned before the heat reached its height. The land revealed stress in small ways. Leaves curled inward. Wells dropped by measured increments. Animals were moved more frequently to prevent exhaustion. Each adjustment required attention. None allowed neglect. It was during this season that the presence of others became more constant. Travelers passed through Ibelin in greater numbers, drawn by routes that had grown safer and markets that had proven reliable. Their arrival brought information as much as goods. News of shifting alliances, of tensions along distant borders, of obligations reassessed by the crown reached Balian not as proclamations, but as fragments carried by those who depended on the roads remaining open. He listened without comment. Information was weighed later in quieter moments when its relevance to Ibelin could be measured. Much of it remained distant, some of it did not. A pattern emerged suggesting that the kingdom's balance was tightening, its margins less forgiving. Demands would follow. Responsibility responded before ambition. Balian did not seek greater standing within the realm, but he recognized that the stability of his lordship depended increasingly on coordination beyond its borders. He began to attend more gatherings, not as a speaker but as an observer. Councils were held in halls that echoed with formality, yet beneath the ceremony lay the same practical concerns he faced at home: supply, loyalty, labor, survival. These assemblies revealed systems at work on a larger scale. Obligations overlapped, authority fragmented and reassembled according to circumstance. Decisions rarely satisfied all involved. Balian noted which men spoke with consistency and which shifted with advantage. Trust formed slowly, not through agreement but through predictability. Disorder pressed closer. Incidents along the roads grew more frequent, though still restrained. Harassment replaced open violence. Signals rather than attacks. The intent was clear enough to those who paid attention. Balian adjusted patrols again, extending coordination with neighboring estates. This expansion required negotiation rather than command. Agreements were reached through mutual recognition of risk. Restraint guided his response. There were calls from some to act decisively, to make an example, to restore certainty through force. Balian resisted them. He had learned that force resolved moments, not conditions. Instead, he focused on reducing opportunity. Visibility increased, routes were altered, markets adjusted their schedules. The response was diffuse, difficult to attribute, and therefore harder to challenge. Justice followed the same pattern. As disputes grew more complex, judgments required greater care. Cases now involved parties beyond Ibelin's immediate authority. Balian convened joint hearings where possible, sharing responsibility for outcomes. Precedent expanded through collaboration rather than assertion. Authority spread without diminishing. This approach carried cost. Decisions took longer. Compromise left few fully satisfied. Criticism arrived quietly in the form of hesitation or delayed compliance. Balian absorbed it without response. He understood that restraint invited doubt, but spectacle invited instability. Time marked him more clearly now. His movements slowed slightly. He delegated more often, trusting structures that had proven reliable. Fatigue became familiar, a companion rather than an interruption. He measured his days carefully, aware that attention once spent could not be reclaimed. Loss continued, uneven and unannounced. A drought strained outlying fields. A market fire destroyed goods but spared lives. Each event required response without escalation. Aid was distributed, repairs organized. The lordship endured not by avoiding disruption but by absorbing it. Expansion followed stability rather than ambition. Ibelin's influence extended along the roads it maintained and into the agreements it honored. Requests for mediation arrived from beyond its boundaries. Balian accepted some and declined others, guided by capacity rather than opportunity. He learned that refusal, when consistent, preserved authority as effectively as acceptance. Internally, the cost accumulated. Nights shortened. Decisions lingered. Balian felt the narrowing of his personal life, though he did not name it as sacrifice. Leadership required presence, and presence displaced other forms of living. He accepted this without complaint, though not without awareness. As the season waned and heat gave way to cooler evenings, the land showed signs of endurance rather than abundance. Fields bore scars of use. Roads held. The tower stood unchanged. Balian walked its perimeter one evening, touching stone warmed by the day, feeling the weight of continuity beneath his hand. He understood now that the lordship had moved beyond its earlier simplicity. It was part of a larger system, bound by obligations that extended beyond sight. His role had shifted accordingly. He was no longer merely maintaining what existed. He was shaping how it would respond to pressures yet unseen. When the first autumn wind returned, carrying with it the promise of change, Balian stood again at the edge of the fields. The land did not announce its future. It waited. And in that waiting, responsibility settled once more, quiet and persistent, asking only to be carried forward with restraint. The rains came late. When they arrived, they did not fall gently but pressed hard against the ground, breaking the crust of summer and pulling dust into the air before settling it again. Water ran along familiar channels, some newly reinforced, others left to test their limits. The land accepted the change without relief. It absorbed, drained, endured. Balian watched the first storms from the shelter of the hall, listening to water strike stone and wood with steady insistence. The sound carried both promise and warning. Too little rain had strained the fields. Too much would undo the work of months. Balance remained uncertain. With the season's turn, obligations multiplied. Accounts were reopened. Agreements reviewed. What had been deferred now required attention. Balian spent long hours with stewards, tracing the movement of goods and labor across the lordship. Patterns emerged that were less visible in times of ease. Small inefficiencies revealed themselves as potential fractures under pressure. He addressed them methodically. Storage practices were adjusted. Transport schedules altered to reduce bottlenecks. Responsibilities were clarified where they had grown informal. Each change was modest. Together, they tightened the system. The roads demanded renewed attention. Rain softened embankments and exposed older weaknesses. Repair crews were dispatched not as a single effort but in sequence, moving with the weather. This required coordination beyond Ibelin's borders. Balian engaged neighboring lords again, renewing agreements that had grown dormant. The language remained practical, free of ceremony. Maintenance was framed as shared survival rather than obligation. Threat followed familiarity. As roots stabilized, they drew movement, and movement drew interest from those seeking advantage without commitment. Reports arrived of increased probing along the edges of the lordship. Not attacks, but tests. Balian recognized the pattern. Disorder sought confirmation before escalation. His response remained controlled. Watch schedules shifted again, but without visible reinforcement that might provoke challenge. Information moved more quickly than men. Signals passed between estates. Patrols overlapped just enough to deny isolation. The system adapted without announcing itself. Justice grew more complex. Cases now involved layered claims, histories remembered differently by those involved. Balian relied increasingly on written record, expanding its use beyond accounting into precedent. Decisions were documented carefully, not for authority but for continuity. He understood that memory, left unrecorded, fractured under pressure. Moral decisions emerged not as singular moments but as sustained restraint. When provoked by accusations of weakness or delay, Balian did not respond. Silence became a form of control. He allowed outcomes to speak where words might inflame. Expansion continued in quiet ways. Ibelin's role as an intermediary grew. Disputes were brought to its hall not because of force, but because of expectation. The lordship became a place where decisions held. This brought influence without display and obligation without celebration. The cost deepened. Balian's days blurred into repetition. Fatigue settled into his posture, visible to those who watched closely. He bore it without complaint, aware that endurance itself had become part of the system. Leadership required not only judgment but presence sustained over time. Loss arrived again, this time in the form of departure. A steward long relied upon left to serve elsewhere, drawn by opportunity or necessity. The transition was orderly. Records were transferred, duties reassigned, yet absence altered rhythm. Balian felt the gap more than he acknowledged. Winter approached with caution. Supplies were sufficient but not abundant. Margins remained thin. Balian resisted the impulse to hoard, releasing resources where needed to preserve function across the region. Stability depended on others enduring alongside Ibelin. As cold settled and movement slowed, reflection followed action. Balian considered the shape of his authority now. It rested less on command than on interdependence. Systems he had tended were now relied upon by others. Their survival no longer belonged to him alone. In the quiet of shorter days, he walked the roads he had repaired, watching water drain as intended, seeing labor bear its delayed fruit. The land responded not to intention but to care repeated. The tower remained, unchanged in form, altered only by weather and time. With winter's arrival, the pace slowed again. Decisions grew fewer but heavier. Each carried forward into seasons yet unseen. Balian felt the weight of continuity more than ambition. He understood that what he maintained would outlast his immediate presence. As the rain eased and the land settled into its colder rhythm, the wind returned, steady and familiar. It moved across the plain, along the roads against the stone. The systems held. And in their holding, responsibility endured, quiet and unremarked, shaping the future through restraint rather than force. The cold did not announce itself with frost but with stillness. Mornings arrived without wind, the air heavy and unmoving, as though the land were holding its breath. Smoke from hearths rose straight before dispersing, a thin marker of life against the pale sky. Sound carried farther in this season. Footsteps on stone, the closing of gates, the low calls between workers reached beyond their usual bounds. Balian felt the change in his body before he marked it in the fields. Movement required deliberation. Muscles stiffened in the early hours. He adjusted his pace without remark, aware that the work did not lessen with the cold. It merely changed shape. This was the season of reckoning rather than growth. Stores were opened in measured portions. Obligations long postponed pressed forward. Debts were settled where possible, deferred where necessary, and recorded where uncertainty remained. The ledger became as important as the field. Survival depended on accuracy. Pressure arrived not through scarcity alone but through convergence. Requests came from multiple directions at once, each reasonable in isolation, burdensome together. A neighboring lord sought mediation over grazing rights strained by reduced pasture. Merchants asked for protection along a route newly exposed by seasonal movement. Representatives from Jerusalem pressed again for assurances of continued support, their language formal but insistent. Balian weighed each demand against the others. He could not satisfy all without weakening the whole. The decision lay not in choosing which request mattered most, but in determining which response preserved balance. He declined some gently, offering alternatives that shifted burden rather than removed it. Others he accepted in part, narrowing their scope. His authority was exercised through calibration. Disorder tested this restraint. A confrontation along a border road escalated beyond harassment, leaving men injured and goods lost. The incident demanded response. Voices within Ibelin called for force, for a clear display that would discourage repetition. Balian listened, but did not act immediately. He traveled to the site himself. The road lay scarred by passage and struggle, its surface uneven where carts had been forced aside. He examined the marks left behind, spoke with those present, traced the movement rather than the clash. The pattern suggested opportunism rather than organized threat. A decisive strike would satisfy anger but invite adaptation. His response was controlled. Patrols were reinforced temporarily, not expanded permanently. Compensation was provided to those affected, drawn from shared resources rather than imposed as penalty. Communication was sent outward, not as warning, but as notice that the road remained watched and supported. The measure closed the moment without opening another. This restraint carried moral weight. Some viewed it as insufficient, others as prudent. Balian accepted both assessments without reply. He understood that leadership often appeared weakest when it refused spectacle. Institution followed decision. Procedures were revised to account for the incident. Reporting was standardized. Response protocols clarified. What had been improvised before was now structured. The system absorbed the disruption and adjusted. Expansion continued through these adjustments. Ibelin's methods spread informally as others adopted similar practices. Coordination deepened not through decree but through imitation. Stability, once demonstrated, invited replication. Internally, the cost sharpened. Balian's fatigue grew more visible. He slept less, not from urgency but from accumulation. The weight of decisions pressed inward, narrowing his focus. He noticed absences more acutely now. A voice no longer present in council, a path no longer walked. Leadership demanded continuity even as it eroded the space for reflection. Loss came again, quieter this time. A long-serving laborer died in winter, his place filled without ceremony. The work continued. The absence registered only in memory. Balian attended the burial briefly, standing among others without distinction. Authority did not separate him from the cycle it sustained. As winter edged toward its end, signs of movement returned. The land softened. Water flowed more freely through channels shaped by earlier care. The systems held under strain, revealing both their strength and their limits. Balian began to think more clearly about succession, though not yet in names. He considered how decisions were made in his absence, how knowledge was shared, how authority might persist beyond him. These thoughts did not arrive as urgency, but as quiet recognition. The lordship's continuity no longer felt theoretical. When the first hint of warmth returned, carried by a wind that shifted direction, Balian stood again along the road, watching travelers resume their passage. The marks of winter remained, but movement resumed nonetheless. The land did not remember conflict. It responded only to care and neglect. In this persistence, Balian saw the shape of his work. He had not mastered events, he had shaped conditions. And in doing so, he had learned that leadership endured not through moments of force, but through the patient refusal to let disorder define what followed. Spring returned gradually without clear boundary. The ground softened first, then the air. Shoots appeared in places that had seemed spent, their color muted but persistent. The wind shifted again, no longer cutting but carrying the scent of growth and damp earth. Movement resumed along the roads in uneven rhythms, as though the land itself were testing its strength before committing fully to the season. Balian marked the change through routine rather than reflection. He resumed early rides, tracing paths that had endured winter traffic and rain. Some held firm, others required attention. He noted them without impatience. Repair followed assessment, as it always had. The land responded not to urgency but to steadiness. Responsibility now extended beyond what could be directly overseen. Systems once small enough to be held in memory had grown layered. Reports arrived already shaped by process, filtered through stewards who understood both method and intent. Balian listened closely, aware that distance from detail required trust more than control. The lordship moved as a structure rather than a collection of tasks. Markets opened on established days without his presence. Patrols adjusted themselves according to conditions already anticipated. Justice proceeded through forms he had helped define. His role shifted subtly from actor to guarantor. Authority rested less on decision than on continuity. Pressure did not recede. It changed form. With spring came renewed passage and renewed testing. Obligations from Jerusalem were reiterated, now framed as expectation rather than request. Balian answered them with measured affirmation, offering what could be sustained rather than what would impress. His responses carried the weight of precedent. What he agreed to now would shape future demands. A moral decision emerged without announcement. He was urged to formalize his standing further, to assert a clearer claim within the hierarchy of the kingdom. The proposal carried advantage and recognition. It also carried exposure. Acceptance would draw Ibelin more directly into conflicts beyond its choosing. Refusal would preserve autonomy at the cost of influence. Balian chose restraint. He allowed the matter to pass without confrontation, responding with language that deferred rather than denied. The decision closed no doors and opened none. It preserved balance. Some saw it as caution, others as missed opportunity. Balian saw it as alignment with what the lordship could bear. Institution followed again. He reinforced internal governance, clarifying lines of succession among stewards, ensuring that authority did not pool around a single figure. Records were duplicated and stored separately. Knowledge was distributed deliberately. The lordship's memory no longer depended on one voice. Expansion continued, but now it was less visible. Influence flowed through reliability. Others adjusted their expectations around Ibelin's responses. Roads converged. Markets synchronized. Mediation requests arrived already shaped by trust in outcome rather than hope of advantage. The cost of leadership surfaced more clearly in this phase. Balian felt the narrowing of his personal horizon. Time passed without markers beyond duty. Fatigue settled deeper, no longer sharp but constant. Loss accumulated quietly, not only of people but of unchosen paths. He carried it without expression, understanding that endurance was now part of what others relied upon. Aging revealed itself in small ways. Recovery took longer. Reflection arrived uninvited. Balian did not resist it. He allowed his pace to adjust, delegating further, observing more. Presence shifted from movement to attention. The lordship adapted again, absorbing this change as it had others. Continuity became visible beyond him. When he was absent, processes held. When decisions were delayed, they waited rather than unraveling. The structure he had tended showed its independence. This realization carried both relief and quiet dislocation. He was necessary but no longer singular. As the season advanced, Balian spent more time walking than riding. He traced the edges of fields, the lines of walls, the courses of water shaped by years of care. Each path reflected accumulated choice. None bore his name. All carried his labor. Succession entered thought without urgency. He considered not who would follow, but how following would occur. Authority, he understood, was not transferred in moments but prepared over time. The work of one life was to make itself less essential. Late in the season, as the wind returned to its familiar pattern, Balian stood again near the tower at dusk. The stone held the warmth of the day. The plain stretched outward, marked by movement that no longer required his direction. Roads carried travelers who did not know his face. Markets functioned without his voice. Justice proceeded without his presence. The land endured. It had endured before him and would endure after. His work had not altered its nature, only its condition. In that persistence, he recognized the measure of leadership he had come to practice. What remained was not command, nor recognition, but continuity shaped by restraint. The systems held because they had been allowed to grow within their limits. The wind moved across the plain as it always had, indifferent to names, attentive only to what stood and what yielded. And in that movement lay the principle that outlasted any single life, that what endures is not the force that demands, but the care that allows time to do its work. Early summer returned with uneven warmth. The sun climbed higher each day, stretching shadows and drawing color from the land slowly rather than abruptly. Grass along the lower fields had hardened to a muted green. Stones, warmed through months of exposure, reflected a subtle heat. Wind shifted from the coast, carrying salt and dust in uneven gusts that rattled shutters and sent loose leaves along the roads. The land seemed to inhale the season, testing its readiness before the human work resumed fully. Balian moved through these rhythms with habitual attention. His rides lengthened as daylight expanded, following the same roads he had repaired and maintained for seasons past. Each inspection revealed the slow accumulation of change. Ruts deepened by carts, embankments softened by rainfall, walls marked by frost and water. These were not crises but reminders of persistent pressure. He cataloged them silently, noting what could be corrected immediately and what must endure until labor could be arranged. Presence mattered less than observation. The lordship had grown in complexity. Roads, markets, and storage were no longer singular responsibilities. They had become networks. Laborers and stewards managed components with partial independence, guided by precedent and instruction. Reports arrived with clarity, shaped by the patterns Balian had set. The systems functioned because repetition had embedded understanding. He now saw that leadership was less about issuing commands than about maintaining these invisible rhythms. Disorder arrived less as surprise and more as test. Travelers along the northern road reported harassment by a band seeking tolls or opportunity. Goods were damaged, minor injuries recorded. Some voices called for immediate retaliation, a show of force that would declare strength. Balian resisted. He visited the site personally, observing the movement and impact. The pattern suggested opportunism, not organized threat. Intervention would be measured, directed at reducing vulnerability rather than seeking spectacle. His response was deliberate. Patrols were adjusted in rotation. Visibility along the road increased, but no force was displayed as punishment. Resources were allocated to repair damage, compensate losses, and communicate safety without drawing attention. The moment was contained. Authority persisted through predictability rather than display. Systems expanded alongside these actions. Protocols for patrol, for reporting incidents, and for distributing resources were formalized. Knowledge that had been tacit became explicit. Responsibility no longer depended entirely on one voice or one presence. The lordship's endurance now rested on the network of people and procedures that Balian had cultivated. The cost was intimate. Fatigue accumulated in the body and mind. Nights offered little release. Attention remained fixed on variables both visible and anticipated. Loss arrived quietly. A laborer fell ill, a road weakened by winter collapse. Each was absorbed into routine. Absence became presence in its own way, yet continuity remained. Markets continued, roads functioned, and justice proceeded along lines he had reinforced. Influence expanded not through ambition, but through the demonstration that Ibelin's systems held, drawing reliance from surrounding estates. Requests for mediation and arbitration increased, already guided by expectation rather than need for assertion. Balian noticed the narrowing of personal space. Each step, each observation, each adjustment carried the cumulative weight of prior choices. Authority required not the energy of spectacle, but the endurance of attention. Leadership meant presence sustained, invisible yet constant. As summer deepened, heat pressed against stone and flesh alike. The plain, once pliant with spring growth, hardened in areas of repeated passage. Water channels carried the residue of rain, but required attention to prevent overflow or stagnation. Laborers moved with the rhythm imposed by season and necessity, their tasks familiar but no less critical. Nothing occurred suddenly. Nothing demanded force beyond measurement and care. Balian's attention remained split between maintenance and anticipation. Roads, markets, water channels, and fields revealed stress points if neglected. Each observation prompted small interventions: repair, reinforcement, redirection of labor. Actions were discreet, preventive rather than reactive. Authority was exercised not through command, but through the shaping of conditions. New pressures emerged as the Kingdom of Jerusalem sent more formal expectations along established lines. Levies, patrols, and logistical support were requested in written form, already shaped by precedent. Balian considered each item in turn, weighing immediate capacity against future consequence. Acceptance was never total, refusal never abrupt. He negotiated limits that preserved autonomy while fulfilling responsibility. Threat and disorder followed the same patterns as before. Harassment along roads, disputes over resources, and minor trespasses tested response. Force alone was insufficient. Balian continued to calibrate: patrol rotations, route adjustments, compensation for damages, and the dissemination of expectation. The goal was continuity, not victory. Internal cost intensified. Decisions were no longer discrete moments, but streams of sustained pressure. Each action absorbed attention that might otherwise be personal. Fatigue persisted as a constant companion, subtle yet insistent. Losses accumulated quietly. The absence of trusted hands, the slow erosion of stamina, minor failures that could not be entirely prevented. Authority demanded endurance rather than display. Yet through these pressures, expansion followed stability. Influence flowed outward without assertion. Neighboring estates deferred to Ibelin for coordination and mediation, not because of intimidation, but because its systems worked reliably. Roads remained passable, markets continued without dispute, and minor conflicts resolved themselves within established procedures. As summer waned, reflection deepened. Balian considered the nature of continuity. His authority had become less about his individual presence than about the persistence of structure. The systems he had cultivated operated with some independence, ensuring that the lordship would endure even under diminished oversight. In these reflections, he considered succession without urgency. Authority needed to persist beyond him. Knowledge, method, and expectation were distributed deliberately. Delegation reinforced stability. No single presence was indispensable, yet each decision contributed to the pattern that would survive him. The wind returned one evening, carrying dust and the scent of distant sea. Balian walked along the edge of the fields, observing the tower, the roads, and the waters shaped by his direction. The land bore marks of human care layered over enduring stone and soil. The rhythms he had reinforced were visible not in spectacle but in persistence. Ibelin had grown from simple lordship to structure. Influence was measured by reliability, not display. Responsibility had extended in scope without requiring ambition. Continuity was maintained without attention drawn to those who made it possible. And in that quiet persistence lay the principle that would endure beyond the individual. That leadership is not measured by the moment, but by the capacity of systems to hold when one presence recedes. With that, the first chapter closed. The tower stood, the road stretched onward, and the fields awaited the next season, silent witnesses to the labor, restraint, and enduring care that defined Balian's lordship. Authority had passed from personal action into method, and the land, like the wind, carried it forward without need for declaration.